Shalom, and welcome to our show, The Crossover, a show aimed at bridging gaps between Jews and Christians. Today we have a very special guest on our show. His name is David Rubin. David and his 3-year-old son were victims of a vicious shooting attack while driving home from Jerusalem in their car. They were miraculously saved from this attack. They survived. And David is now traveling the world, sharing his testimony of faith, along with explaining what's really happening in the land of Israel. Here's Mitch and David Rubin.
David Rubin, welcome back to The Crossover.
Thank you.
Glad to have you again. Dave, today's show is Defending the Children of Shiloh, and I heard you speaking last night at a private home, and you said something to the effect that all things that happen generally happen for good in the end. There's a good outcome, even though it doesn't appear that way in the beginning. And on December 17th of 2001, you had a toothache that was about to transform your life. Why don't you share with our viewers what happened that day?
I had to go into Jerusalem to take care of this toothache because we don't have any dentists in our area, in our small town. So I asked my children if they'd like to come with me. And my daughter, who was then 8 years old, and she said she doesn't want to come. She wants to stay home and play with her friends. I asked my 6-year-old, and she said, well, are there Arabs there? And I said, sure, there are some Arabs, but it's okay. And she said, no, then I don't want to go. Now you have to understand, the children have been so traumatized from all the terrorism that even just something as simple as going to Jerusalem and possibly seeing some Arabs was something that shook her up greatly.
And how long a ride is this from Shiloh to Jerusalem?
30 to 40 minutes.
On one road?
Oh, yes. On the historic road that we call the Path of the Patriarchs, because that is the road that the biblical patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, rode their camels on. So I took my 3-year-old son, because I wasn't going to leave him home. We went into Jerusalem, went to the dentist. The dentist said, I don't see anything wrong with your teeth. I don't know what you're talking about with this toothache. So my son and I went out for lunch, and then we went to get haircuts and went on our way. 6 p.m., we're on our way home. So I heard that there was a terror attack on the radio against someone in Samaria, and that the driver had been wounded. Just as I heard that, the radio went dead, the car engine went dead, and there was a massive hail of bullets on the car. I saw the bullets right in front of my eyes because they had tracers on them, which means that those who were shooting wanted to make sure that they saw exactly where the bullets were landing. So they were like sparks in front of my eyes. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll never forget it. Half an inch from my eyes. The bullets whizzed past. And at that point, I felt a terrible, terrible pain in my leg, and the blood started flowing out like an open fire hydrant. And that's no exaggeration. And then I remembered I had my 3-year-old sitting behind me. I quickly turned around and looked at him in his baby seat. And my son's name is Reuven. We call him Ruby for short. I turned around and I said, Ruby, are you okay? His eyes were just staring straight ahead. His mouth was wide open. I could see that he was breathing. I didn't see any blood at all. So I assumed that he was okay, but he was just in shock. And they were still shooting. This all within the span of a few seconds, and I realized I had to get out of there, whatever my condition. And I shifted the gears from park to neutral, back to park, into drive. I turned the ignition. I hit the gas. I tried everything I could, twice. The third time the car started.
So you were on this road parked, stopped?
No, I wasn't parked. I had been in drive.
And it just stopped when the bullets came?
The car didn't stop. The engine stopped, and the car was slowly coasting down the hill. It was a slight decline in the road. So the car was, while all this was going on, the car was slowly declining down the hill, and the terrorists continued shooting.
On foot?
And I couldn't even tell. I thought they were shooting from the left because I got shot in the left leg. They were shooting from the right. When I managed to start the car after 3 times of shifting gears and hitting the gas pedal, and the car started, I drove 120 miles an hour to get to the next community, which is called Ofra. Normally about 5 minutes from there. I got there in about 2 minutes, maybe 2.5 minutes, knowing all along that driving 120 miles an hour I could lose control of the car and crash, or I could just collapse from the loss of blood, because the blood was coming out massively from my leg. I got to Ofra, and I opened my car door and I started shouting for an ambulance. And nobody answered. And there was a young woman who was sitting nearby who started screaming, "Ambulance, ambulance," at the top of her lungs. And everyone who was within sound's reach came running over at that point. Some teenagers from the bus stop, the gas station attendant came running up to the car, came right to my window, and he said, "David, I'm a medic." Well, he didn't say David, he didn't know my name, but he said, I'm also a medic." He ripped off my shirt and he started wrapping up my leg to stop the blood flow. He handed me his cell phone and said, "Quick, call your wife." And I tried to dial, my hand was shaking, I couldn't even dial. So he said, "What's your number? I'll dial it for you." He dialed my number. I called my wife and I said, "I've been shot in the leg, and they're trying to stop the blood flow, and the ambulance is on its way, and Ruby is okay." Ruby is my 3-year-old son. And she said, "Okay, I'll try to get to the hospital some way as fast as I can." And they came jumping out of the ambulance and running up to the car, and the attendant from the ambulance, the medic from the ambulance, pulled out Ruby from the car, and he said, "Wait a second, he's also been shot. He's been shot in the neck." And they whisked the 2 of us into the ambulance on stretchers, and they started the journey to the hospital, the nearest hospital, which is in Jerusalem. And he stopped breathing twice as we were traveling in the car. And at that point, I just lost all my composure, because up to that point, I could deal with getting shot in the leg. But to see my 3-year-old, who would never hurt a fly, just this innocent little boy, being shot for no reason other than he was a Jew who was traveling on this road through Samaria, that was something that emotionally was very difficult to bear and to deal with. And then when he stopped breathing several times as we were traveling in the car, I got very nervous. But we got to the hospital, and the ambulance stopped and let us out. And they took us into the emergency rooms. They started to work on both of us. We were in 2 separate emergency rooms. And the doctors in my emergency room said, "David, we're going to have to operate on both of you very quickly. The bullet apparently that hit your son fractured his skull and went into his neck this way and came out the other side, causing a lot of internal bleeding in the cerebellum." And so he said, "We're going to operate very soon, but there's someone here who wants to see you." So a gentleman walks in and says, "David, I'm the Public Relations Director for Hadassah and Kerem Hospital. I just want you to know that you're the 1,000th victim of terrorism to be hospitalized in this hospital in the past 1.5 years." Okay. Now, I wasn't quite sure why I was saying this. I thought, am I going to get a prize? I mean, it just seemed like a comic moment in the middle of the suffering and the trauma. And he said, "No, I'm just telling you that because my job is to protect your privacy and that of your son. And if you want me to, there are a lot of news reporters outside who want to interview you as the 1,000th victim, and if you want me to keep them away, I will keep them all away and I'll protect your privacy." And at that point, all the frustration of the previous 1.5 years and several years of terror resulting from the Oslo Accords and it all just came to the fore and to the surface, and I just said, no, you bring them in here. I have what to say to them. And basically, after my operation, for the next 24 hours, I held a press conference in my hospital room, and I was heavily dosed with painkillers, so I was able to talk, and I didn't feel too much pain.
For our viewers, David, what happened with Ruby, your son?
Well, my son was in the intensive care unit of the hospital, of the children's ward, for about 2 weeks, and I was constantly being wheeled in my wheelchair to visit him in the other wing of the hospital, and he had totally lost his balance, and his sleep patterns were disrupted, and he was sleeping about 20 to 24 hours a day, and he would occasionally wake up for 5 or 10 minutes, and then he'd go back to sleep, and the memory loss was particularly frightening.
What about today?
But afterwards, the doctors explained that that was just from the trauma, and that it would gradually come back if we work at it.
So now, 4 years later, 3 years later?
4 years later, he is functionally 100% after a couple of operations and a lot of doctor's visits and many months of psychological therapy.
Oh, well.
And it's just an amazing
fortunate.
miracle, and
Yeah.
there were some amazing miracles that we experienced.
Well, so you became a spokesperson for being a victim yourself in terrorism, and for the community and others at large, obviously, when you became the thousandth person there.
Well,
you ended up becoming a spokesperson.
I was basically a divinely appointed spokesperson.
Yeah.
I didn't receive an official appointment, but I was convinced that after what we went through and the miracles that we experienced, where the head of the intensive care unit said to us that if the bullet had gone 1 millimeter, this is a millimeter, for those who don't know the metric system, if it had gone 1 millimeter further into my son's neck, it would have hit his brainstem and he would have been dead. And he said, you don't know how blessed you are. You know, and there are other miracles, such as my getting shot in the left leg when they were shooting from the right side, which enabled me to drive my automatic car.
And your car starting.
And the car starting. The car mechanic called me 5 days later while I'm laying in my hospital bed, and he said, David, this is the car mechanic. I just want to let you know that that we have the car and that we're working on it, and there's about $15,000 worth of damage on that car, including in the engine. There's one thing I don't understand, he said. Why can't we start that car? Now, I know that I drove that car 120 miles an hour after it had gone dead, and after I had shifted gears 3 times to try to get it to start. And I know that I got to the ambulance in the next community, and from that point, the car mechanic is telling me that the car went dead, and they had to tow it from Ofra, where the ambulance was, to the police station in Beit El, and that the police couldn't start it again, and they had to tow it to the car garage in Jerusalem. And, you know, and now he's telling me he can't start the car either. So
your angels were working that day.
All I know is that I really felt like I was just carried on the wings of God and brought to that ambulance. And so I feel grateful for what happened to us, and that we're both functionally 100% today. But there's also a little feeling of irrational guilt that I used to hear, you know, from Holocaust survivors, that, you know, they feel sort of an irrational guilt, like, why did they get to live? Right. And I felt like I had to do something to give back to those in my community, and there have been so many in my community.
So tell us about
children.
That. You took a catastrophic negative event and fueled it all into a positive action with the Shiloh Israel's Children's Fund. Is that the step?
Yes, yes.
Well,
if we just take a walk in my neighborhood, you know, we come to the Shoham family directly across the street. Their 5-month-old baby was killed by a rock this big when he was riding home in his parents' car coming back from his grandparents' house, a visit to his grandparents. The rock hit him in the head, and within 4 days, he was dead. Shmuel Yerushalmi, a 17-year-old boy. He was the kind of boy who used to greet everyone with a smile when he would pass you in the street. And he was killed in a bombing in Jerusalem when he was coming back from taking his SAT exams. If you walk to the next house on his block, you come to the Kessler family. Their granddaughter, Sarah Gila, who was 19 years old, was killed in a Jerusalem bombing. If you walk 3 houses further down the block, you come to the Seaton family. Their 17-year-old son, Avi, was shot by terrorists who infiltrated into his high school basketball court in his community just north of Shiloh. Noam Apter was 18 years old, a young soldier. This young soldier who combined religious studies with military service was in his yeshiva, in his religious seminary, on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. He was preparing the meal in the kitchen with a couple of other boys, preparing the meal, the Sabbath meal. There were 100 boys in the dining hall. Terrorists infiltrated into the community and into the kitchen. They shot Noam and his fellow students. As he was falling to the floor, he managed to reach out and lock the door connecting the kitchen to the dining hall, thereby saving all of the students in the dining hall. There's so much suffering. And the rabbi's son was shot and killed, and there have been others who've been killed and wounded. But we've seen so much suffering for the children in Shiloh and the surrounding communities in the biblical heartland of Israel. And I just felt that something had to be done. Something had to be done to bring some comfort to the communities that have been traumatized by terror. That's what I felt, so I started the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund as a way of helping these children and of helping the children of the biblical heartland to plant their roots firmer in the land. So we support educational projects, we support recreational projects such as building playgrounds and parks, things that people in America take for granted. Right. But we can take it for granted, because just to go out in your car and drive someplace to a park or a playground, which people in America take for granted, is something that we can't just do. Yeah. You know, people hesitate every time they go out on the road. You know, so I started this as a way of getting support from people to people in America who care and who are willing to help in this great enterprise that we've started.
To build parks, to help the children have some semblance of a normal life.
Yes,
even those activities.
Even something as basic as we've started a lending library for bulletproof vests. It may sound crazy to somebody in America, but this is something that's very commonplace, and there are people who wear bulletproof vests, and a bulletproof vest costs $1,000 for a bulletproof vest. Yeah. And families don't have it.
No.
Not
when you have so many kids. Hard for us to fathom what you're sharing with us, David. Let me ask you this, because you must have thought of this. And what's the answer to the terrorists, to creating a state there? I mean, terrorism is there. You have a radical group that, we know they don't want land. They can argue that all day long. They want to kill you because you're Jewish. You represent God's people, and you're representative of God, so they can get you. If they wanted land, they would have had peace a long time ago. So how do you get peace in the Mideast? What's the deal?
Well,
you had something called a population exchange, I think you said.
I believe that there is the land for peace formula, which is basically just a land for a piece of paper formula, is a formula that doesn't work. We've seen it over the past 10 years. And I think that what needs to be done, I would go so far as to say there is no peace plan that has a chance of working unless it includes population exchange. Very often they call it transfer in Israel, but what it really is population exchange. And 40% of the population in Israel supports transfer in some form, according to a survey that was done about a year ago. Now, what we're talking about is the completion of a population transfer that began in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, when Israel took in hundreds of thousands, even millions of Jewish immigrants that were escaping the Holocaust and being driven out of the Arab countries. So what we're talking about is completing that population exchange. We happily took in our brethren, and now it's time for the 22 Arab countries with a landmass which is quite substantial.
We hear 600 times the size of Israel.
Yes. Okay, so that landmass, and they're certainly able and capable to take in their brethren.
To absorb them.
There is no peace plan that has a chance of working that does not include that element.
Right.
I have no doubt about that. And we're going to see that over time,
Because that's the element
even if
that
there
will
are
work.
more withdrawals.
And I guess that's a whole other show to talk about why the Palestinians are being used as pawns, perhaps, instead of being absorbed back by their culture.
Well, 80% of the Arab population of the land of Israel is in favor of continued terrorism against Israel. I think it's important to stress that. We're not just talking about Yasser Arafat.
Let me ask you just one more thing, and I know we're really out of time here. So when you look back at the events that happened to you and Ruby, and you drive down this road today, years later, because it's the main road you must drive to go to Jerusalem. So how do you deal with the scars and the lingering thoughts every time you go past that road and you're on that spot where all of a sudden you were attacked? You and all the other Israelis, the Jewish people that have gone through this.
Well, I have to tell you, the first time that I rode past that spot, I drove past that spot, I had tears in my eyes. But we get used to it again, and I have to say that when one has suffered for something that means a lot to him, it becomes an integral part of him. And it says in the Talmud exactly that there are three things that are acquired through great suffering, and one of those three things is the land of Israel. And we've suffered a lot for it.
And the Jewish resolve is what I call it. I mean, to endure, as you do in your land, with so many obstacles, with the traumatizing of the children, with, I heard you say parents won't even drive in the same car together with the fear of both of them being killed.
My wife and I will not drive in the same car together unless we are in bulletproof transportation.
So do you have any words to tell us here in America in closing, as we deal with terrorism also? And
I think that the world has to wake up to the Islamic force that is fighting against it. And when they speak in Arabic, the Muslims say, first we're going to get the Jews, and then we're going to get the infidels. Or in other words, they very often say in Arabic, first we're going to get the Saturday people, and then we're going to get the Sunday people. And I think until the world wakes up and understands it for the threat that it is, which is a force worse than Nazism, a force that wants to take over the world, until that point, we're not going to win the war on terrorism. And I think it's important for President Bush and all other world leaders to return to that earlier vision of understanding of what this Muslim terrorist threat is all about.
well, David, thank you for sharing with us, founder of Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, and hope to have you back again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's good to be here.
Good night.
We at the Crossover believe that it's time for Christians to not just read Bible prophecy, but recognize that it's happening right now, and choose to act and be a part of being on the right side, on God's side of Bible prophecies, by participating in the holy process of helping the Jews that are being obedient and potentially sacrificing their lives by living in the biblical heartland. David Rubin's website is www.shilohisraelchildren.org. Thank you for staying tuned with the Crossover.